great to see you all, and really delighted you could join. Sorry about my slight hitch there. We're going to be recording this webinar, and we are delighted to have you here live though. And thank you very much for making the time today. As you know, this is the National Institute for Health and Care Research Birmingham Biomedical Research Centre series of webinars, and tonight's is called Health Tests on the High Street, Convenient or Confusing? So this is one in our series done by our different researchers. And so I'm just going to show you my next slide to tell you a little bit more about us. And we don't have the facility for chat with the webinar, but we do have, if you've got something that you wish to type in, I can see that someone's got their hand raised. You can type it in to the Q&A box there, and then we will be able to have a look at that. So thank you very much for raising it there, and hopefully we can pick up. So the meeting is now well and truly being recorded. And we have, say, this series of webinars that we're delivering. And for those of you that perhaps don't know anything, or perhaps want to know a little bit more about what the Birmingham Biomedical Research Centre does, then let me tell you. We are basically a collaboration between a university, in our case, University of Birmingham, but each biomedical research centre, and there are 20 in total, is a collaboration between a university and hosted by an NHS organisation. In our case, it's University Hospitals Birmingham NHS Foundation Trust. But we are also happy to tell you that it is with all these other organisations as well. So in addition to that, you can see that we're quite widespread. So although we're called Birmingham, we're actually wider than that as well. So we collaborate with these other organisations to deliver world-class research. And we are publicly funded because the National Institute for Health and Care Research is the research part, or the research arm, if you like, of the National Health Service. And we work to deliver real fantastic changes for people by turning scientific discoveries into diagnostics and treatments for people perhaps that haven't had any help otherwise. And we're in our Birmingham Biomedical Research Centre focusing on inflammation and the associated conditions with that, because as you know, sometimes we experience inflammation. It might be, part of the healing process, and sometimes it's absolutely fine. It might be, something like a little bit of pain or some swelling or heat or loss of function, for example. However, sometimes, in some cases, the body overreacts, and too much inflammation can cause further problems and is linked with many health conditions, including arthritis, infectious diseases, diabetes, cancer, and gut diseases. So it's really important. However, we are very lucky that in the Biomedical Research Centre that we've got some eminent experts who are also keen at looking at the diagnostics in a slightly different way. And that's who you'll be hearing from today. At the bottom of your screen, or top of your screen it may be, there's a bar which looks perhaps a little bit like the one that I'm showing you now on the screen. And that's where we've got the Q&A function. So if you want to ask a question, you can do that. At any point, you can type that question in. You won't be able to speak, but we'll see this at the end of the presentation. And then we'll be able to select some of the questions. We have a few, about 10 to 20 minutes, depending on how quickly the presentation goes and so on, for us to be able to ask our experts to answer those questions. And then we'll finish promptly at 7. So that's what the plan is. And I'm delighted to introduce you now to the experts that you're here to hear from, who are going to talk about health tests on the high street and what their findings have been. Are they convenient or confusing? So we're going to be hearing from Dr. Claire Davenport, Bethany Hillier, Professor John Deeks, and Professor Alex Richter. So I'm going to shut up now, pass you over to them, and start off with Passing to you, Dr. Claire Davenport.
Thank you, Laura. I'm one of the research team that did the research that we're going to be introducing today. Just hoping that I can read the slides here. Try again. Bear with me a second.
Okay. If you need me to drive it, just let me know, but I think that should be fine.
Let's have a look. Perhaps if you could just drive it for me, Laura, it doesn't seem to be moving.
Okay, and I'm just going to hide my picture now.
So I'd just like to spend a few minutes just putting our research into context, really, and explaining why we chose to do this research. And I'd like to start just by sharing a TikTok video that was posted in September last year. I'll need you to move forward, Laura.
Okay.
So in Tesco's now, you can get all different types of tests. You get a strep test, you can do your own UTI test, you can do HIV testing, you can do Bob rapid test for feces, you can do FSH rapid test midstream, you can also do an allergy test. How cool is that? You can also get an iron deficiency test. You can get a cholesterol test. You can get you not have a clue what that is, but you can get one of them. You can get a stomach ulcer test, and you can also get a vitamin D test. How cool are these? If you want to diagnose yourself, because let's be honest, you can't get a GP appointment these days, can you? So you can come down to your local Tesco and pick up a test. Any free for £2, any free for two as well. So you're welcome at that. Come self-diagnose yourself at Tesco. You can start a COVID test as well.
Could you advance, please, Laura? So that video just shows how available and how diverse the number of self-tests there are that are available to us now. And I think more concerning, and in response to this particular post, people were thinking that these tests might be a replacement for seeing their GP. So these tests are freely available for us to use now. And they might be a replacement for seeing our GP. Could you advance, please, Laura? And again, thank you. And again, great. Sorry, could you go back? Thank you. And this availability of tests has prompted, people to speak out really about concerns about these self-tests, about whether they're accurate and whether they may potentially cause harm, particularly self-tests for conditions that we know are potentially more serious, like cancer. Next slide, please. And I'd just like to draw your attention to two papers that were published in the BMJ earlier this year, and an associated investigation that was conducted by the BMJ, and commentary which can be accessed, where the full results of the research that we did can be found. Next slide, please. So where are we at? How did we get here? Well, the first direct-to-consumer test that was available to buy was the predictor pregnancy test, and that came onto the market in 1971. And really, there wasn't much to see in this area until the COVID pandemic hit, and we all became very familiar with self-testing for COVID. And since that time, there's been an explosion in the number of self-tests available to buy on the high street. Next slide, please. Direct-to-consumer tests, these are tests that you can buy without any advice or from healthcare professionals. So direct-to-consumer tests can be purchased either online or in shops. We were particularly looking at self-tests. Could you advance, please, Laura? So these are the tests that are highlighted here on the left of the slide. And what sets these tests apart from other types of self-test is that the consumer is responsible for not just for buying the test, but they take the sample, they perform the test, and they also interpret the test result. And this is in contrast to other types of tests that as consumers we have direct access to, where perhaps we decide to buy a test, but a laboratory might process the sample and send us a report back. Next slide, please. So what did we do? An advance, please. We went shopping. And again, please. So we shopped within a 10-mile radius around the University of Birmingham. We looked at supermarkets, pharmacies, and health shops. We bought all types of tests except for pregnancy tests, and we excluded these types of tests because they've been on the market for a long time. And they're endorsed for use by the NHS. Advance, please. And we looked at what information was on the test boxes, the instructions for use leaflets that are inside the box, and also had a look at the test equipment, and we tried to use the test equipment. Next slide, please. Specifically, what we did was we looked at what information was available to consumers on the test box, so at the point of sale, so information that might help a consumer decide whether they should buy the test, whether that was a test that was appropriate for their use. Advance, please. What information was available inside the box about doing the test, so how to do the test, and what information was provided about how to read the results. And next, please. And then what information was provided to consumers about what they should do after they've done the test, so once they have a test result. So, for example, was there advice to go and see their GP, whether they should repeat the test or do further tests, or whether no further action was needed? Thank you. I think it's over to Beth now.
But shall I have a go at trying these moving of the slides as well? Okay, just while that's being sorted. So what did we find? Our set included 30 different self-tests. Here you can see a variety of the different medical conditions that these tests claim to detect. So we have 19 different medical conditions for a variety of different sample types, and these ranged in 2023 from about £2 all the way up to £40. Okay, shall I give it a go?
Yes.
Right. Oh, I think that was me. Okay, so thank you very much, Claire. So I would like to go back to those 3 stages that Claire talked about. So of before the test, taking the test, and then after taking the test. So I will take you through each one and some of the issues that we found along the way. So first of all, before buying the test, the question is, should I test? So let's think about what is important for consumers to know at the point of sale. So that's on the box itself. So we believe that consumers should be well informed and equipped with the knowledge to understand the implications, including benefits and the harms of their choices. So we want to know, what is the test for? So what is the health condition that's being tested? There you go. Who should use the test? Are there a list of risk factors and symptoms? And why use the test? Is it reliable and accurate? Oh, I don't know if it's delayed. I'll just carry on. There you go. Okay, so in terms of the health condition being tested, this was often inconsistently described. It wasn't clear if the test was generally checking, for example, prostate health, or whether it was actually checking for prostate cancer. Also, sometimes they can be misleading. For instance, some tests claiming to test for male fertility, in fact, only measured one element of fertility, such as sperm count, when there are other factors of sperm quality to consider as well. And another clear example is the cholesterol test, which only measures total cholesterol when we all have both good and bad cholesterol. So this total measure is not very helpful. So who should use the test? So generally there was a lack of information. There you go. Few specified sex and none specified age or commented about the suitability of use in children. None of the test boxes provide risk factors for screening, and only 4 out of the 30 specified symptoms for diagnosis. So, onto why should I use the test? Is it accurate and reliable? So, many of the boxes did present an overall accuracy value, but did not give accuracy values for a positive and negative test separately. So, if the test is positive, how sure can I be that it is a true positive and not a misdiagnosis? And similarly, if the test is negative, how sure can I be that it is a true negative and not a missed diagnosis? Okay, so here, our bar chart here is showing for how many tests out of the 30, whether this information was provided on the box. So the majority of the tests did not explain whether the test was for screening or diagnosis. Screening tests are meant for people without symptoms, and they may have risk factors such as being in a certain age range, whereas tests for diagnosis are meant for people with symptoms. So that's to identify an illness or condition that is causing those symptoms. So, yeah, most tests lacked any information about who should use the test, and only 2 described when you should not use the test. Okay, so moving on to step 2, taking the test. So that includes getting the sample, applying your sample onto the test device, and reading and interpreting your results. All done yourself, at home, so issues can arise along each of these steps. And so why does this matter? Well, if the instructions aren't clear or the equipment is difficult to use, people could end up with failed tests or false test results. So I'll show you some examples of some practical challenges. So on the left is when members of our team, including a medical doctor, tried their best to follow the instructions for a blood sample test. For our set of 30 self-tests, the most common sample type was blood, for example, for cholesterol, thyroid, and prostate markers. They all involve collecting your own blood by a finger prick like this. So perhaps this is not as easy as you would think. Out of 5 in our team, only 1 managed to get a usable sample, and the rest, they had either not enough blood, blood dried up, or there were too many bubbles. And moving on to here on the right, we have an instructions leaflet for a bowel health test. And yes, it is on a toilet, as you're meant to place the required sample on that instructions leaflet, which of course is a fecal sample. So I'll move on to some more examples. Okay, so just looking across the whole set of our self-tests, the 30 self-tests, most of them had at least 1 high-risk concern. And these concerns were equipment related or sampling related or because of the instructions or interpretation. And many tests had concerns that spanned across multiple areas. So for example, for some tests, the T and C result windows, or for some dipsticks, the marks for T and C were not on there, which is for test and control, and this will indicate the test result. Regarding the sampling process, so one example is the pipettes that do not reliably collect the blood samples as shown in the previous pictures. And for instructions, so I'll just show this picture. So does anyone know what this is? And if you do you have one sitting at home? My guess is probably not. So what this is called a centrifuge. And for 3 of the tests in our set, users were instructed to use this if their sample was cloudy, so if their urine sample was cloudy. And here's an extract from one instructions leaflet. So just bear in mind that this is a self-test that a layperson is meant to be able to conduct at home, not in a lab setting with lab equipment like this. So we also looked at readability. So readability of the instructions leaflets. So we calculated the Flesch reading ease scores, which are a numerical score that take into account the length of sentences and length of words. So the higher the score, the better the readability and the easier it is to read. And most of the instructions for use leaflets, that's the IFUs, they had a score of less than 70, which is about the reading level of a UK school year 9 student. So most of them were harder to read than this. And we also compared them to some control documents, namely the first and last Harry Potter books. The scores for these were 77 and 71, so both easier to read than the instructions leaflets. So next, just take a look at a couple of leaflets. So we also considered the font size, which is hard to demonstrate through the screen. We have a better example on the left, which is the HIV test, and this had size 10. I think this was the biggest. And on the right, this is size 6. So the leaflets for half of the 30 tests had a font size of less than 7. So for scale, put a ruler here so you can see how small this is, and you can see, or maybe you can't, that's size 6 and 7 at the top, so pretty small. Okay, so let's move on to step 3, after the test. What are you advised to do after you have your test result? So 3 of the tests offered no advice at all. For 13 self-tests, the user is advised to see a healthcare professional if positive or negative with symptoms. And for the remainder, they are advised to see a healthcare professional if the user has a positive result, and then with some mixed advice for a negative result, such as repeat testing or suggesting no action. So also something to consider when thinking about stage 3 after the test is the accuracy of the test. So are the test results accurate? How much should I trust the result that I got? And would we say that, we would also say that it's important for stage 1, so before buying the test as well. So are you going to buy a test if you don't know whether it's accurate, or if you do know that it's not accurate? Okay, so I'll move on to accuracy of the tests and also how well they were evaluated by the manufacturer or the maker of the test, and what is the quality of that evidence. So to do this, our first challenge was to get access to this evidence. So we asked the test companies for evidence documents for all 30 tests, and we unfortunately only got evidence for fewer than half of the self-tests. Okay, so then we assessed the studies looking at test accuracy, called clinical study reports, and we looked at studies about the ease of using the tests for lay people, and these are called layperson study reports. So here are our results. I will just summarise them. So we use a traffic light system for the quality assessment procedure, and with red meaning high risk or high concern, amber meaning unclear risk or concern, and green meaning low risk or low concern. So you can clearly see that we have much more amber and red circles here, and actually over 80% of these circles are amber or red, meaning unclear or high risk or concern. So just to quickly summarise, Many of these self-tests have been approved on the basis of evidence from laboratory studies. So when we also need studies conducted in real people, in real life settings that are similar to what you would expect with proper usage of these tests by lay people. And much of the evidence that we assessed contained poor descriptions of the study populations. Okay, so I'm going to move on to, I think John is next.
Thank you. See if I can control this. So I'm going to summarize our findings and to try and understand a little bit as to why we've got these problems with these tests which have just arrived on the market, and what we can do to try and make things a little bit better. So, is this going to work? What we've observed is that there's quite a lot of self-tests on the market. We did our sample back in April 2023, so it's a couple of years old. We redid the sample again 2 years ago, well, sort of at Christmas last year, actually. And actually, rather than having 30 tests, we found 60 tests. So the market is expanding. We don't actually know how many tests have been sold of this type, but clearly, if the supermarkets are stocking more, they must be being sold for that purpose. When we looked at those extra 60 tests, we actually found that most were exactly the same tests that we've previously seen, but they've been marketed under a different name, have been distributed by a different company or at a different supermarket. So it's a bit misleading that you might see different tests, but actually they end up being, when you look at the box, you find it's the same manufacturer for the same test being sold in different boxes from that. We want to be clear that some tests are pretty good. They're not all bad things. There are some things we've shown which are actually quite poor, but there are some other ones where we think this is really important that we don't get our messages out there to suggest that maybe pregnancy tests shouldn't be used, because there's some types of tests where they've already been evaluated and there's good clinical guidelines in the NHS which say to use this. But for many, the design of our studies, of the studies we found, or the tests to be inappropriate. The fact that you've got tests there which can't tell you whether it's a T line or a C line on the manufacturer's thing, that's really confusing and dangerous, because it means people might use the results or take the results wrongly. So when we say there are some high risk things, it's because the results could be wrong, because the instructions are wrong, or that or somebody might get the wrong sample and so on from that. So the documentation we saw is really the worst thing of this, is actually the consumers. If you look at this, a lot of the time, we took the role actually thinking, if we were consumers, would we understand what this is saying? And a lot of the time we think there's not informed decision making that we could make, because the information is poor, either on the box or on the instructions. And then, as Beth explained, the evidence base actually isn't available. The companies have told us that they are commercially confidential documents, and therefore they're not available to us. We got several responses from the manufacturers when we asked for that information. So we can't actually assess them. And when we did get the 12 out of 30, the studies, as we've learned about, they're not really the sorts of studies which tell you how well these tests work in real life, in the way in which consumers will use these. They are sort of done in an artificial setup, which are probably going to always overestimate how accurate these tests are. Finally, we are always concerned that actually so I'm still waiting for a slide to come, actually these tests have been followed through a process by which allow us to see that they fit with doing more good than harm. And the way in which we do that is to look at clinical guidelines. So we check to see whether or not clinical guidelines match with the use of these self-tests or with point-of-care tests or similar tests. And actually, of many of the tests here, we found, I think it was a third of them that actually were contrary to guidelines, that we would say you shouldn't use these tests in these situations. And that's really a risk that these tests, some of them could be harmful. Can you move the slide on, please? Okay, can you move it again, please? So I'm going to try and take you through what actually is the process which a self-test goes through to try and understand how has this occurred. One more slide, please. So if you take the journey from a manufacturer, the manufacturer obviously make the test. They produce the lateral flow test or whatever type of test it is, and they also identify the other equipment such as the swabs which are needed to complete the test process. They also write the instructions for use, the IFU document. It's their job to write that, and that is the point at which they claim that this test is suitable for certain situations. So it's their job or their opportunity to say this test can be used for diagnosis, it can be used for screening, it can be used for monitoring. That's not done by checking with guidelines, with experts, with clinical experts. It's done by the manufacturers. It's their choice. They can write this down about that. And some of these, documents we see that actually they're saying they're there for marketing purposes. It implied here that actually they may be making it better to say, well, if we screen, more people will actually use this test. Monitoring might be, you can use this test many times and things like that. We don't know what's happened here, but it doesn't seem like it fits with the evidence of our experts to say how we should use this. When they've got their instructions for use, they do the studies. And as we said, they're regarded as confidential. And these studies are the basis by which they can then get a registration of the test, which means we get the CE marking for the test. So this is done against the laws, if you like, the laws about what it is that how a test should actually be assessed. Now we have regulators, so the MHRA is our UK regulator, but they actually don't do the assessments themselves. They go through another body called the notified bodies who do that. And so the company, the manufacturer, pays a notified body to actually assess the documentation. It's not usually assessing the test. It's it's a desk-based exercise to actually say whether or not these are correct. And that's how is the notified body who then says this has got a CE mark. And when that's allowed, they can then go to a distributor and sell the test. So one of the problems we've got is that the legislation which the notified bodies are working with, a lot of the time it's legislation which was produced in 1998, which is a long time ago, more than 25 years ago. And so some of the assessments are done from a long time ago. They're using sort of regulations which are out of date. There's been an attempt to try and change the regulations in the EU, something called the 2017 regulations, but they've been delayed of actually being implemented. And that's one of the reasons in which some of these tests are on the market, is they have not really had the up-to-date assessments by the correct legislation. Now, post-Brexit, the MHRA can actually change the regulations, and one of the things we're doing with them is talking about that. Can we just one more slide, please? So when the CE mark's there, the distributor, another company, can put the test in the box. They can change what's on the box a little bit. They can put other advertising things on it to a small degree. And then that goes to our supermarkets or pharmacists, and you can buy them from that point onwards. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So the implications then is that the CE marking that we can see, and that's the reason why we can get these on the market, we don't think that actually that's a good indicator of quality, and it shouldn't be trusted. And so we are trying to encourage the supermarkets to look at this a bit more carefully, because they are stocking things on the basis that the CE marking is fine. It's legally, it's okay, but we think there's problems with actually this isn't going to actually help the public. We need changes in the regulations. We've gone to the MHRA with our findings, and they have taken those 30 tests that we've got and are rechecking them to see whether or not those CE markings are correct. And we're waiting to hear their news on that. We also think it's really important that, as well as the regulations being changed, which hopefully will happen from the MHRA, is that we set a standard. So there is a consumer-based standard which makes sure that tests on the market are fit for purpose and do what the members of the public need them to do. Next slide, please. So this is the one things we started to think about how we do this, and we need to do more research to work with consumers to find out what is it that you need to actually make sure that we give you the right information to make wise and informed decisions when you buy a test. Next slide. What we also need to think is that actually these self-tests have really good purposes. They can actually make us to manage our health ourselves without having to go to a GP. But that process of working out what is it that you need to know and what is useful is something which the consumer need to take some opportunity to talk about. It isn't something that we want the manufacturers to drive all the way through this. It's more of the consumer's need, which we need to investigate. And to be aware here that actually these tests are often marketed to say this is going to make it better for public health, for primary care. But actually, many of the tests we've got here are going to cause more demand on primary care because they're going to tell you, go and see the doctor, whether you get a positive result or a negative result. Finally, then, well, what are we doing with this? Next slide. We've got a project on top of the one we've described to you, the guide, DTCT guide, where we're trying to put together the guidance and to work with regulators. So we're working with experts, which include people working in supermarkets, in pharmacists, as well as laboratories and clinicians, to try and work out what is it that we need to put together to make sure that we can have some sort of standard to make sure that the evidence is correct, that the labeling is correct, that the test claims and the instructions for use are useful and suitable. And we need to make sure that this fits in with any new changes in the regulations, which hopefully the MHRA will introduce. Next slide. So there's an opportunity for people here to get in touch from here. We're looking for consumers, particularly and all members of the public, to help us to be part of this project. Last slide. So thank you for listening. We've got some time for some questions. Just showing you more. The team we had together for this project, it got us out the office to go shopping for a day around Birmingham, which was a good day out to this, but many thanks for all of our team who've done a lot of work together to put this together. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to John and Claire and Beth for that really comprehensive run through. And I know Alex is part of the team as well. So thank you very much, all of you, for taking the time to do that. We have got time now to answer some of the questions that we've received. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a quick look at the questions now, ask you those, and then John, perhaps you can just direct whoever's going to be answering it, perhaps, or someone can say, oh, I can take that, that's absolutely fine. And I think what I'm going to do, as just if that's okay with you, start off with one. The first question for me is number one. How accurate and reliable are these tests compared to NHS or GP tests, do you think?
Alex, are you able to?
From this work that we've done, it's actually not possible to evaluate that, Laura. So I can see there's another question later on. when we went asking for the information and to try and understand the studies that people did to try and assess accuracy, either the companies didn't provide them or said that it was private information. But we were able to look at a few of them, and we had some concerns. So, for example, for a menopause test, which is obviously a hormonal change in women that happens in later life, the control group wasn't younger women, it was men. And so if you were designing an optimal, or if you wanted to really, try and differentiate between women at different stages of their life, that was potentially quite difficult to do. So it is really important. And, a lot of the work that John does is designing proper evaluation studies for tests so that, we can be really confident in the results that come out of it. And it's difficult to assess that from this. That's not to say that some tests, like pregnancy tests, and there's some really good HIV tests that are in use, and these are endorsed by the NHS and they've been evaluated within the NHS. But most of these tests that have hit the market over the last year or so haven't been tested within NHS yet, so we don't really know what to do with them. And so when a patient comes to clinic with one of these results, it's difficult to know what to say to them, because you don't really know what the test means or how to trust that test or even what to do with the results.
It's
Thank you very
also
much.
when you look at the numbers on the documents, on the boxes, they all many of them make a claim, say this has got 99% accuracy or 98% or 97%. They're all high numbers for that. And when you actually look back to understand what the study that's been done, that percentage measure isn't saying, will this diagnose the condition? Will this accurately diagnose the condition? So there's one I've got beside me here, which is a prostate cancer test, and it says it's 97% accurate or something like that. It doesn't say that's 90% of the time it will get it correct as to whether you've got prostate cancer. What it actually is saying is that the study we did of this biomarker gives a close relationship to the biomarker of a different test, to a different manufactured test. That's not the same question as saying, does this actually tell me whether I've got the disease? And that's a constant thing through all of these, that it's actually telling us about the percentage of this biomarker matches to a similar biomarker. And that's a very different thing from finding out, does this diagnose what's wrong with me?
Or I can just see there's a question from John as a follow-up from that about the COVID tests.
Yeah.
And actually the COVID tests were much better evaluated than most other tests on the market. Just it was a point in time. There were deficiencies in it, but at least they had been evaluated against large numbers of patients. So John's had lots of experience on evaluating these. But yeah, it's not all tests. We're just giving a representative look of, answer on the ones that we looked at.
Yeah, there's another question actually. Is there a regulatory body responsible for evaluating or approving direct-to-consumer self-tests before they reach the market? So I suppose...
Well, that's the as I described, as these notified bodies are the way in which it's been done. So they are working in response, they are from the regulators. So in the UK, it's the MHRA. Most of these are actually through the EU regulators. So they are the people who are responsible in the end of the day, is the regulators, but they've given that job to these notified bodies. They've got so many tests to actually evaluate that it has to be done in that way. So there is a process, but it's actually the regulatory documentation, the actual laws which need to be updated. What we've been hearing, I mentioned there's this 2017 change in the EU regulations, but it's not really going to be implemented. It's been delayed because of COVID. It's been delayed by it's going to take a while for companies to actually to increase the assessments that they're going to do. So I think what we heard last time, I think it was that actually this is going to be implemented by 2030 or something like that. We're talking a long time before the actual regulatory changes which are needed are going to be implemented, which is, that's not good.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Another question we've got was, it was the lack of evidence of accuracy due to companies perhaps refusing to give it up? Or do you think that's because they weren't accurate?
The information has been given to all the notified bodies. So the MHRA is asking for that information. So we can't answer that. I don't think it's that personally, I don't think it's that they're not accurate. Is the studies are the wrong studies to have been done? As I described, that there are studies which are not telling you whether you have the diagnosis. They're telling you whether this biomarker gives the right number for a similar biomarker.
Okay. One question we've had is, surely these are medical devices and should be regulated independently. Should there be pre-market and post-market, or there should be pre-market and post-market follow-up? But are they actually medical devices, as far as you're concerned?
They fall under the medical devices law. They are devices. So they do fall through from that, and there's special sections of it for in vitro diagnostics. So they are, and so one of the things which has changed in the last year has been the importance of post-marketing surveillance, that manufacturers are required now to have a post-marketing process, and for that information to go in the UK now to the MHRA. So that is being done. So I mean, we work quite closely with them, and we're sort of more than hopeful. We can see that they're doing good things to improve things, but it's a new technology effectively. Although it's lateral flow tests have been around for quite a long time for pregnancy tests. The way in which they're being used in the UK, it is a post-COVID experience that we're dealing with, and so it's taking us a while to catch up with the regulators to be able to deal with this. Nothing seems to work fast in these sorts of situations.
I've got a lovely question here for you. Are public interests represented in the discussions apparently being planned or in progress? Because another concern is the cost of some of these tests probably is not affordable for some people who might have a tight budget.
Claire, do you want to tackle that one?
I'll have a go. So in terms of sort of the public view, really, I think first of all, I'd like to just follow on from what John was saying, that there's a difference between having a law in place and actually how that is translated into practice. And that's one of the reasons why we're very keen to involve the public in developing standards and documents which will actually move from a law to actually, what does this look like in practice, and what information is needed by the public. So certainly at the moment that hasn't happened. And can you just remind me the second part of the question, Laura?
Well, it was really about, what do you do when people have tight budgets, when perhaps they don't have very much money to be able to afford them?
Absolutely. So I think this is something which which has been raised before, I think, by has been raised by our public contributors to this research, is that at the moment this market has the potential to widen inequalities, because the cost of many of these tests is prohibitive. So that indeed is a concern, but to my knowledge, it hasn't been addressed at the moment, and I'm not sure whether the MHRA are the body to actually address that. But that's certainly a very important point.
Thank you. Right. Okay. Someone's made a lovely comment. I think the webinar should be made available to the Which Guy and to A-Level Press. What does the panel think? I believe you have done quite a lot of press, so haven't you, recently?
Yeah. Sorry, John, go on.
So the Which we've been engaged with Which from the very beginning. They'd actually updated their websites based on our results within a day or two after our publication, and we're trying to work with them as to how we can help them to actually work out how to make sure which is a useful sort of thing. So whether this seminar is the best way to do it, I don't know, but we're working with them.
Oh, thank you very much. And we've got time just for probably one or two more, I'm afraid, before we need to end. But I've got one asking, why do you think it takes so long to have laws in place to protect the public?
John, shall I take that one?
Please do.
So everyone, I run a diagnostics laboratory for the NHS, and so we do lots and lots of testing. And one of the problems with this regulation and why it's taking so long is we have a lot of tests that we use all the time in the NHS that do not meet this new standard, but we know through practice are very useful. And so we are at real risk that some of these companies are going to withdraw useful tests from the market because they don't want to spend the money doing these extra validation studies, which is going to be required by the new regulation. So I think the MHRA has recognized this. And so they need to get the balance between, not leaving huge gaps in the market for testing and withdrawing good tests, but making sure that these direct consumer tests and other tests coming onto the market are good. I mean, we have this quite, often in the NHS. We've got things like, aspirin, for example, which if it went through all of the side effects profile when it was licensed years and years ago, might have had a really good, difficult time. But, we use that medicine quite regularly. And I think it's the same with some tests that we've understood. So, they're being a bit cautious. And that's why this regulation's taking a bit of time, because there's complexity behind it.
Thank you. Okay. And I suppose I've got a question here, which I don't know how or who is responsible for this one, but why aren't trading standards getting involved? Or why can't trading standards get involved?
They can. I can take that if you like, John. They can. At the moment, and this is one of the problems here, is that medical tests are not the sort of marketing and the laws around marketing of medical tests. That effectively there aren't any, which is very different to medicines. So if something went very wrong with a test, or the marketing of a test was very misleading, then consumers can report that through the yellow card reporting scheme, which they may or may not be aware of. But I think the feeling is that isn't used very much at all, and it's very much a sort of reactive rather than a proactive approach. So one of the things that we are hoping to get involved in and developing is looking at regulation around marketing of these tests as well. Sorry, John, I jumped in there. I don't know if you wanted to say anything else.
That was good. There's a question I can see at the very end, which is about GPs, which is an important one, as to know how GPs are dealing, because we've talked with GPs a lot, and the BMJ issue was actually written. There's an editorial written by 2 GPs about it. GPs will generally not use these tests. If you turn up to a GP having had done one of these tests, the GP will not be able to sort of trust the test. They will not know what to do with it. And so they'll usually replicate it, or they'll start again. So in terms of saying, have you saved a GP any work from doing this? The answer is no, because the GP will then have to be saying, well, actually, we'll have to take a new sample and send it off. We don't use them because they don't have a good quality assessment. All of our GPs have a duty of care to make sure that the tests that they're using or they're asking laboratories to do on their behalf are quality controlled. And these self-tests, we don't know that, and you don't know how well the sample was done. So it's a problem that the GPs are frustrated from. The Royal College of General Practitioners have written down quite carefully too. They're very sort of concerned that this is going to cause more work, and that people don't understand that they're not actually going to be useful for diagnosis.
Thank you very much, all. And I know we've whizzed through and we haven't answered every single question, but we've tried our best to do it. And I appreciate the panel for addressing that so beautifully. And I want you to say thank you to everyone that was involved with your team as well in doing this. I can see it's a huge piece of work and it'll be ongoing, but also how grateful we are that as a result of it, you know, I feel safer actually knowing that these things are being looked at and carefully considered. And it may be, for instance, that people listening, you know, feel hopefully a little bit more secure now as well, knowing that people are monitoring this, it's not being left. And it might be, for instance, that people feel that they want to now, you know, get more involved. And it might be, for instance, if people might consider being involved in a clinical trial, because this is how we learn, isn't it? So we would love you to have a think about whether or not you could be involved in a clinical trial. And again, we take your safety very seriously. And there's a link gone into the chat. Thank you very much to Claire Wickett for posting that. We've got a link there in case you did want to get involved. And it might be that you want to get further involved and more deeply involved by being part of our public patient involvement team. So it might be that you wanted to be coming along, having a discussion with people like John and Alex and Claire and Beth, and talking to them. And we talked about you know, patient contributors. Might be that you wanted to be part of a group or a small discussion group on a long-term or short-term basis. And again, we're putting a link in the chat to that in case you did want to get involved. We would love to hear from you. And again, at the Birmingham Biomedical Research Centre, we say get in touch with us, and we're really happy to hear from you. It might be that you want to join in some of the fun things that we showed those photos of that we do. We win awards for it, and we are delighted if you would give us feedback on today's session today. That really helps us because we're doing another one next month on inflammatory liver disease from our theme there. It's going to be headed up by Dr. Palak Trivedi, or Professor Trivedi as he is now. It's going to be on the 20th of November, again at the same time, 6 to 7. Again, it'll be recorded if you can't make it in person, but you will need to register. And we would really love to hear from you. But all that remains me to do now is to say thank you very much for attending today, everybody. It's great to have your questions, great to hear from you, and fantastic to have our panel of experts here who have given up their time to do this. We appreciate the work you're doing, and thank you all for joining. So take care, everyone. Goodbye.